Hello. What you are about to see is part one of a two-part conversation with Dr. Vishwanath about the spread of health misinformation during this COVID-19 pandemic. Hello and welcome. I'm Adi Kao, Editor-in-Chief of the AMA Journal of Ethics. Thank you for joining us for this video edition of Ethics Talk. I'm here with Dr. Vishwanath, Professor of Health Communication at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. We will be talking about the spread of health misinformation during this COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Vishwanath, thank you for being a guest on Ethics Talk today.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
So spreading health-related falsehoods is far from a new phenomenon. The peddling of snake oil and other quack remedies dates back centuries. In fact, in 1849, the American Medical Association established a board to analyze quack remedies and to enlighten the public about its dangers. Physicians have long served a learned intermediary function for patients. But the speed by which misinformation can spread through today's digital media ecosystem can overwhelm any information gatekeeping, especially during public health emergencies like a pandemic. So what should individual physicians do in response to the viral spread of health misinformation via Twitter, Facebook, and other digital media channels? For example, what can be done to refute misinformation without drawing more attention to it?
Thank you for that question. So it's very difficult and maybe unfair to put the onus on individual physicians, given almost 90% of American population or adult populations are on some kind of a social media platform. It would make it very difficult for them to chase every bite of misinformation out there and try to refute it. I think so that's almost an impossible task. So what can individual physicians do? I think when physicians remain the most trusted source on health information, that has not changed. So that's the good news for us. So at the end of the day, when there is a physician-patient interaction and the patient raises any myths or any questions, or any doubts, I think it's a great learning opportunity and a great opportune moment for physicians to counter that myth and counter and educate the patients. However, I think the challenge remains that the physician-patient interaction is very limited, right? So on any given month or a given week, I think we go to physicians either for routine checkup or if we are sick. So the opportunities to intervene are limited. I think my own feeling is that we have to shift the burden, if you will, from individual physicians to a more collective mobilization of physicians, such as AMA or other networks of physicians. And the reason I'm saying that is, given that there is tremendous credibility attached to physicians and the trust people have in physicians,
Right.
It's very critical that they do not sit on the sidelines, but actively and aggressively intervene whenever it is warranted. That means, certainly individual physicians can play a role when there is a movement, opportune movement, but it is more important for physicians to mobilize collectively to counter these myths, I think. And that means it's very critical. Networks and organizations such as AMA become more important as gatekeepers and as arbiters of sound and fact-based, evidence-based information.
Yeah. So reflecting on what you just said a moment ago about, the ability and obligations of individual versus institutional actors, that certainly in terms of the healthcare and medical field, here's a sampling of the number of Twitter followers among different account holders. Barack Obama has 120 million, Justin Bieber 112 million, Donald Trump with 83 million, Kim Kardashian has 65 million. The CDC, which in many ways is a medical/public health institution, has almost 3 million. You have about 600, and I have 0 Twitter followers. So to say there is asymmetric reach between health professionals and those in politics and entertainment would be an understatement.
Mm-hmm.
So how can health professionals and policymakers address the challenges and possibly some of the opportunities presented by this asymmetry to better inform and engage the public on COVID-19?
Mm-hmm. That will always remain the case. There will be some exceptions when physicians have huge followers, but those are only exceptions. So, some of the physicians who are now on network TV, for example, or cable TV, could have more number of followers. So I don't think we can ever compete with that, given the nature of our work and the jobs we have, not just as a physician. I'm talking about myself as a social scientist, and physicians who they have a day job. We all have a day job, and that's not being on Twitter and tweeting on Friday night. But given the credibility, so there are 2 things. What I am asking for is a somewhat more sophisticated look at this perceived impact of social media. And there are a couple of ways to think about it, right? So one is, even if these people have a lot of followers, that does not necessarily mean that every tweet on every topic they tweet on will be believed, right? Their followers will believe them and follow them for certain reasons, for entertainment value. So maybe the latest fashion, right? The latest outrageous tweet. But if they go out of their expert realm and start talking about something else, people may very well question it, right? So they stay in their lane, which is not always a desirable thing. But what I'm saying is, and we can come back and talk about it. But so that's one thing. So not every Twitter follower they have doesn't mean that their pronouncements on some of the things you and I are worried about, COVID-19, will have a profound impact. I think it will have a big impact, but not profound. The second thing is, we don't have to easily give up, because the physicians as a group have tremendous credibility, and journalists, when they cover news, do rely on physicians. When we talk about gatekeeping function, I continue to think, and I continue to bemoan the fact that journalism, especially local journalism, is waning. But journalists, national journalists, still remain important and critical gatekeepers. And certainly we can influence through that gatekeeping function of journalists. And that's why I was originally proposing this idea that even if an individual physician may or may not have a huge following, he or she has the ability to leverage the power of institutions because of her or his credibility. So whether it is AMA, whether it is major mainstream media and other organizations, they have that power they have that credibility. And that's one way to counter and counter these people who have larger following and who are misleading people, and ensure that you have a larger reach to spread as much as possible evidence-based information.
Yeah. No, I think you make some excellent points, and I'm thinking about the points you've made about public confidence and trust in physicians that's still fairly high, and this notion of kind of staying in your lane.
Right.
That said, health misinformation on the internet can sometimes come from healthcare practitioners.
Right. Mm-hmm.
For example, there are physicians who perpetuate false beliefs about the safety of vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
What can and should be done to counter misinformation from healthcare practitioners?
Right. So this is really a very critical issue, I think. Those two letters at the end of the name, MD, matter a lot. And we have been discussing this notion of credibility. Yeah. And certainly when a physician, a person with MD after her or his name comes forward and misstates something, it carries weight. Particularly, many journalists are very sophisticated, very thoughtful, but certainly sometimes they do feel obligated if there is a counter narrative. With a doctor questioning, something that is conventional wisdom, and that's how we have seen the anti-vaccine roots take hold, our beliefs take hold. When Andrew Wakefield with those two letters to his name started spreading this misinformation. But let us remember this. A physician can do it not by himself or herself, but also with the abetting of other institutions. In that case, Lancet, which published that paper without asking the questions, and that's sort of magnified, I think. Yeah. So that's one issue. Countering them right away is important there, right? The institutions have to be very responsible, journalism, journals, etc. The second issue is, of course, they don't need to publish in journals. These days, we are seeing this COVID-19, the very preprints, for example, right? Yeah. So where I think the challenge we are finding with COVID-19 is particularly interesting because now we are publishing papers without that kind of a rigorous review, particularly when the science is changing so fast. And I, as a physician scientist, can publish a paper while waiting for review. I can put it out on Twitter, right, as if it's news. I think that's where it's very critical for physician scientists to counter it right away. We know that they should not repeat it because by repeating that misstatement, it will plant a seed in people's lives. So but without repeating that falsehood, they can still actively and aggressively counter it. And that's very critical because they have the credibility and they should not let it lie out there in the public arena. Obviously, we cannot chase every myth, every falsehood that is out there, but the critical ones should be countered, should be questioned, because I think that should not remain uncontested. So.
Yeah, no, I think you make some excellent points, and that clearly there's in some ways a confluence because obviously misinformation about vaccines predated this current pandemic, and there seems to be an emerging confluence of these misinformation currents that we're having to deal with, especially when we get hopefully a vaccine against COVID-19 in 2021.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very critical for us. And the confluence, in fact, I think it's an interesting choice of words. And I have used that too, the confluence of interest. I think what is unusual now we are seeing is this anti-vaccine, anti-vaxxers and anti-vaccine, people with anti-vaccine beliefs, people with Second Amendment beliefs, people with very conservative politics, almost reactionary right-wing politics. They're all coming together and finding some kind of a common cause, questioning government authority and government public health authorities, I think. And that will make it a challenge if and when we have that vaccine. Obviously, we are several months away at the very least from a vaccine, but it does become an important issue to what extent the vaccine that will be introduced will it fit into the conventional narratives of the anti-vaxxer beliefs, in which case, a lot of people will refuse to take the vaccination, or does it fit into a newer narrative? And that becomes very critical. The newer narrative is, now we have a solution to get back to your normal routines and normal lives, get back to that livelihood. The false debate between livelihood and life, I think, can be countered when we say the introduction of vaccination can now potentially let us get back to the normal. So I think which narrative, which frame wins is very critical, and we have to be prepared for that. I can tell you today, there are people already waiting to talk about why COVID-19 vaccine is not important, and it's a false thing. And so we have to be very aggressive. One bit of good news for us is that if indeed we have an effective vaccine, a lot of people are anxious to go back. 60 to 70% said they will get vaccinated, or 60%, 70%, depending on the survey. And I think, so it's not all bad. It's a question of pushing the other 20, 30%. There will always be 10% who are anti-vaccines. There's not much you can do. But given how much it has disrupted our lives, my assumption is that a lot more people will be open to get the vaccine.
For more COVID ethics resources, please visit the AMA Journal of Ethics at journalofethics.org. And to our viewing audience out there, be safe and be well. We'll see you next time on Ethics Talk.